The series starts with Kate Woodcroft, a prosecutor, leaving court and heading to her office. It's raining outside, and she comes in all soaked. Her colleague Brian greets her and compliments her on her win in the Butler case. He also informs her about a new case, mentioning it's a next-level one. She then says goodbye to Brian and enjoys a drink while looking at the rain outside. Meanwhile, Sophie Whitehouse, the wife of James Whitehouse, a member of parliament, shows up at a party. People greet her and ask her about James, so Sophie tries to call him to remind him about the party but can't get through. At that moment, James is in his office having a meeting with an older lady to listen to her complaint. The conversation goes well when James decides to help the lady. However, his assistant comes up and whispers something in his ear that completely changes James' expression. James instantly rushes home and texts Sophie to tell her to meet him there as well. Feeling that something is off, Sophie leaves the party immediately, thinking something has happened to the kids. Sophie and James finally get home, and James immediately admits that he made a big mess this time. They sit down, and James tells Sophie that he's been having an affair with one of his parliamentary aides, Olivia Lytton. It had been going on for 5 months, but he stopped it 2 weeks before the conference. James weakly claims it was just sex. However, Sophie knows there must be a reason he is confessing all this to her right now. It turns out the story is about to break in the news, and that night the chief of communications comes to their house to talk to James about how to handle the situation. Sophie is furious and just wants to protect their children first. Meanwhile, Kate is alone in the office and starts to read about the new case she received. Chris Clark, the chief of communications, arrives and reads aloud all the news that has already been released about James' cheating scandal. Sophie is so hurt that she runs to another room. All the happy memories between her, James, and the kids come to her mind, and she can't believe James did that to her. She then can't help but look up the face of Olivia, the woman her husband slept with, and vomits right on the phone screen. In the other room, Chris keeps instructing James on how to dilute the hate that is coming his way. After taking a moment to pull herself together, Sophie walks back to the other room and declares that she will stay with him through this because they have been married for 12 years and have 2 children. James and Chris are happy to hear that, and Chris gets ready to leave while briefing them on what they should do with the press. No elaboration. Only admit that James made a mistake, regrets it, and now wants to prioritize his family and his work. At that moment, they realize their daughter Emily has been staying on the stairs and listening to part of their conversation. Sophie brings Emily back to her bedroom while James sends Chris away after Chris sarcastically jokes about James's affair. James goes upstairs, and Sophie starts to question him about the details of his affair. She is shocked to learn James slept with Olivia in hotel rooms 20 or 30 times, and she understands it was not just sex. They then go to sleep with their work clothes and makeup on. The next morning, Sophie wakes up, turns on the TV, and watches James' public declaration about his affair. She later goes to pick up her kids from school and feels awkward around other parents, but she tries her best to keep her cool. Meanwhile, Tom, the Prime Minister, heads into James' office. James reassures the PM that this is the first and last time he has made a big mistake in his marriage. Tom also agrees to the amendments James wants to introduce to the immigration bill. Tom then leaves after reminding James to pay more attention to Sophie's public image. At home, Sophie is preparing a quick dinner for Emily when Emily asks a question about a university club named Libertines, a club that James and Tom were members of during their time at Oxford. Sophie then recalls her time at Oxford when she first met James. That night, she was drinking with her colleagues, Alison and Holly, when she caught the look of James from the other side of the room. In the present, both James and Sophie are trying to act like nothing happened to maintain their image of a perfect family and a highly respected politician. Meanwhile, Kate keeps working late overnight at her office on a high-profile case. Her only entertainment is sometimes calling her friend Alison to have a quick chat before returning to work. The next morning, James sets up a lunch date at the Parliament building with Sophie. Sophie can't hold it in anymore and tells him that she will stay with him, but she isn't willing to act like nothing happened in public to polish his image. Sophie mentions that her mom forgave her dad for cheating on her and she doesn't want to make the same mistake. James apologizes to her and tells Sophie that he wants to fix his mistake and is willing to do whatever it takes, even giving up his career and resigning. Sophie is moved by these words and lets him hold her hand. In the car on the way home, Sophie recalls the memory of when she and James were dating. James was the perfect guy that everyone wanted. He had everything a girl could dream of, and at that moment, Sophie already knew they would get married. In her office, Kate flips through the pages of the case file and discovers that the high-profile case is actually related to James and Olivia's affair. Kate gasps when she realizes how serious the case is. Meanwhile, on his way out the door, James is stopped by 2 detectives. They've been trying to contact him regarding Olivia and an allegation of rape. It is a metaphorical blow to James as he hears the news. James then rushes home and informs his wife about the worst news he just received. The scandal of his affair with Olivia hasn't lost heat yet, and now she accuses him of graping her and has taken him to court. Sophie is speechless with the news. The next day, Kate arrives at the court and prepares for the first trial of James's case. She will argue against James. Meanwhile, James and Sophie also arrive at the court and are surrounded by reporters. They go inside and meet Angela Reagan, who will defend James. Sophie comes into the court hand in hand with James because she's convinced Olivia just became bitter after James broke up with her and is trying to defame him for revenge. Of course, James insists that he's innocent, but Sophie can't help to have second thoughts. After the court, Kate leaves with her aide Maggie, who thinks James looks like a rapist because of his handsome appearance. Kate believes it will be a difficult case since the boundary between consensual love and grape is thin, and society's views on the matter are very ambiguous. The grape allegation against James immediately affects his position and that of his close friend, Prime Minister Tom, in Parliament when a member brings it up and questions Tom in the middle of their parliamentary session. Chris doesn't like this and asks Tom to cut ties with James so that he can keep his image clean, but Tom refuses to do that with his best mate, and he believes James is innocent. Sophie goes to pick up her kids as usual. And this time the other parents look at her with suspicion. A close parent even makes an excuse to avoid a planned gathering with her family. People don't want to be involved with the family of an alleged rapist. Her kids also ask her about their dad, but Sophie insists that James is innocent and tells them they have a surprise waiting at home, a new puppy. The kids are overjoyed and are distracted from the huge scandal their family is dealing with. At night, Sophie hears James sounding angry with someone on the phone, so she walks in. It is Chris, who tells him to keep a low profile during the trial and expresses his desire to ascertain if Olivia is the only woman James slept with. Sophie believes her husband and thinks Olivia is a liar who wants to destroy James's life. She then instructs her husband to reach out to Tom in private. James does so, going to see Tom at the back of the Parliament building and confirming that he didn't assault Olivia. James is terrified about something else, that the press will dig into their past at Oxford when they were in the club named Libertine. However, Tom seems confident about that, as they have nothing to hide. He assures James that things will soon be over and returns inside. A flashback shows a party of the Libertines in the past when they dressed in tuxedos and spray expensive champagne around a chamber while praising themselves. A female server walks into the room to bring more champagne, and a young Tom comes up behind her, tries to produce some milk. Everyone cheers Tom, and the server walks away scared and embarrassed, while James is the only one who runs after her and apologizes on behalf of his friends. He offers to provide compensation, but the woman runs away. In the present, Kate has dinner with Richard, her married former pupil master with whom she is having an affair. Here, they also discuss the case, and Kate tells Richard about what Maggie said. James comes back home and finds Sophie sitting in the dark. She tells him how much she regrets quitting her career. She tells him that when all of this drama is over, she will go look for a job. But James doesn't care about that. What he cares about is that Sophie has to be in court with him every day of the trial so that the public knows that she trusts him. After he leaves to go upstairs, Sophie recalls her past during her studies when she had a tutor partner named Holly. While Holly focused on studying and spent most of her time in the library, Sophie was more of a cool girl and spent more of her time socializing. The next day, James and Sophie again go to court. The jury is told not to go online or look up stuff on their own about the case. They can't talk about it outside of court either. The report says that the grape happened a week after Olivia and James stopped seeing each other. James is accused of graping Olivia in the elevator. Olivia enters the courtroom to tell her side of the story on the witness stand, after swearing to tell the truth. She begins to recount her affair with James. After 2 months of working for James, one Friday night Olivia forgot her gym bag at the office and returned to retrieve it. She bumped into James as he was leaving, and he invited her for a drink. They went out together, where James subtly flirted with Olivia. Olivia asked him what his wife would think about what he was doing, and James said that Sophie trusted him. A week later, James booked a hotel, and they started their affair. After several months, on the 5th of October, James called Olivia into his office and broke things off with her. She was shocked to hear that because she was in love with him. Back at the court, Sophie can't handle all of these love story details anymore and leaves the courtroom in front of everyone's eyes. She runs to the door and struggles to get home. All the details of her husband's affair become so real to her that she feels like she is falling into a pit. Later, James comes home and finds Sophie helping their son read a children's book. James insists that Olivia being in love with him was not mutual. Sophie tries her best to accept this explanation and promises to stay at the court the next day. Meanwhile, Maggie digs into James's past and discovers information about libertines. She tells Kate, believing that if they look carefully enough, they can find something. The next day in court, Olivia tells everyone about what happened on the day of the incident. On that day, James was very upset after a journalist wrote a bad article about him. Olivia did her job as his aide, chasing him around and telling him to come back to the committee room because they was going to have an important meeting in a few minutes. James then asked her if he's arrogant, to which she answers, "You're ruthless when you need to be. Cruel sometimes." James stopped for a moment after hearing that, then said sorry to Olivia. She thinks the apology is about how he ended their affair. For some reason, Olivia said, sometimes arrogance can be terribly attractive. She said this to test whether James still has feelings for her. James then entered the lift and kept the door open for her. She walked in, and they collide and kiss. They started to do more, and James opened her top and savagely leaves teeth marks on her left breast. Olivia says she was in fear the whole time that someone might stop the lift and see them. She tried to push him away and telling him, "Not here," but James wasn't listening. He proceeds to rip her tights and underwear and forcefully does things to her. During that, James tells her, "Don't be such a prick, tease." As Olivia begins sobbing and breaking down into tears, court is stopped for a break. Sophie leaves the court with James, feeling that some part of her is broken. Chris runs to Tom and insists that he must cut ties with James, but Tom again refuses and tells Chris he was raised to stand by a mate when he's down. The next day, the trial continues. This time, it's Angela's turn to question Olivia. She tries to emphasize that Olivia was trying to provoke a reaction from James when she said, "Sometimes arrogance can be terribly attractive," and then consensually followed him to the lift and kissed him. Angela adds that Olivia's shirt wasn't ripped as she claimed because all the buttons were intact. Most importantly, throughout the incident, Olivia never directly said no, she just said "not here," which could imply she was consensual with the act but uncomfortable with the location. At home, Sophie notices James's bad behavior, which she hadn't paid much attention to before because love made her turn a blind eye. She sees that he has no problem lying and even influences their kids to lie as well. After dinner, Chris irritably rings their doorbell. It turns out he was right when he asked if James did something similar in the past, and apparently, he did. An administrator from Oxford went to the police, claiming a girl had accused James of assault, but they lost track of her. James seems more confident after hearing this and calls it nonsense. Chris emphatically tells them the name of the girl, Holly Berry, and Sophie is shocked to hear that name, revealing that Holly was one of her friends back then. That's all Chris needs to hear, knowing the accusation wasn't silly but from an actual former Oxford student. He leaves immediately to convince Tom again to drop James. At this point, Sophie can't keep her poise anymore and snaps at the au pair when the poor girl just tries to help. James calls Tom, and this time even Tom knows he's a mess. James desperately reminds Tom that he owes him. A flashback shows a party night of the Libertines, with everyone drinking and having fun. When James didn't see Tom, he went upstairs and found Tom smoking smack with one of their mates, Alec. James convinced Tom to stop and leave the building. As they were leaving, Alec was still on the roof. Tom, still high, encouraged Alec to jump, and he did, dying instantly. Tom knew he had messed up and intended to walk back to check on Alec, but James stopped him and rushed him to run away so their future wouldn't be ruined. James kept that night a secret and even disposed of the drugs for Tom when the ambulance arrived. James was scared to death and runs away in the corridor of the dorm. Sophie calls James back to the present and confronts him about Holly. Of course, he denies and denies, but this time, Sophie isn't on his side anymore. That night, Sophie has a nightmare where she dreams of Holly walking toward her, jolting awake just in time. Meanwhile, Kate is hooking up with Richard, a cheater, while his wife is out of town. Afterward, Kate talks to Richard about Olivia's case, expressing that she's losing hope in helping Olivia win. Richard tries to reassure her, but Kate insists on being alone, kicking him out in the middle of the night. Richard is offended and accuses Kate of taking the case too personally, suggesting that she's convinced James is a rapist because of the power he holds over Olivia at work. He reminds her that he himself used to be her teacher and then leaves. At home, Sophie reflects on the last time she saw Holly. She had gone to Holly's dorm for their assignment and found her packing to leave, with emergency contraceptive pills on the table. Sophie kept pressing for an explanation, but Holly threw something at her, forcing her to leave. In the present, Sophie apologizes to the au pair, Christina, for snapping at her last time. She then confides in Christina about how exhausted she is with the whole situation and how the entire nation is now targeting their family. Sophie seeks reassurance, asking if James is truly not a brutish person, and Christina confirms this. The next day, Sophie informs James that she wants to take the kids to the countryside for the day, meaning she won't be in court with him but promises to be there when he presents his evidence. Meanwhile, Kate is having coffee when Angela confronts her about the grape allegations against James from the 90s, asking if Kate was the one who spread the rumors. Kate denies being involved. Later, at the office, she checks with her assistant, Maggie, who confirms that she has always followed the regulations. As James heads to court, Kate seeks emotional support and calls a friend, who is a school teacher. It turns out Sophie goes to her in-laws' house. While the kids play with their grandfather, Sophie talks with her mother-in-law and realizes that James was always taught to be self-righteous and believing it was acceptable to cheat. That day in court, a witness named Miss Ledger, Olivia's friend and colleague, takes the stand. After hearing from Olivia about what happened in the elevator, Ledger confirms that it was assault. Angela reminds her of the affair between James and Olivia, but Ledger remains firm, insisting that what happened to Olivia was still wrong. That night, Sophie returns home with the kids and finds James asleep on the couch. She pours herself a drink, and James joins her. Sophie confronts him, asking how he could cheat on her so easily. Especially when they seemed to be so in love while he was having the affair with Olivia. Sophie once again confronts James about Holly, but James argues that it's all in her mind. Despite his denial, Sophie no longer trusts him and begins to piece things together. She starts to suspect that the grape happened during the end-of-year party. Although her memory is unclear, Sophie is determined to find out the truth. A further flashback reveals how Holly was partying with Sophie and their friends before leaving the party and running into James in the corridor, who was fleeing from a drug incident. James flirted with Holly and began to kiss her. Things escalated quickly, and Holly found herself being graped by James. When she tried to resist, he told her to stop being such a tease. While still in shock, James stopped, asked if everything was okay, and then left. All of these memories belong to Holly, who now goes by the name Kate. Kate, aka Holly, goes to her best friend Ali's house for emotional support. Kate seems guilt-ridden and unsure of what to do. Ali thinks it's because Kate actually knows James' wife and advises her to confess to the judge and drop the case. However, to her surprise, Kate's problem is even bigger than that. Ali already knows about Kate being raped, but she never imagined that the person who did it was James. Ali realizes the irony of the situation Kate has put herself in and becomes worried, finally understanding why Kate has been so restless lately. Meanwhile, at home, Sophie recalls the night after the end-of-year party. She had returned to her room when James banged on her door. She let him in, and he started telling her about the incident with Tom. He then asked Sophie to be his alibi to cover up his involvement in Alex's death. Sophie starts piecing everything together and realizes that it was the same night James messed up twice. The next day, James gets ready for court, reflecting on his encounter with Holly. Sophie has breakfast in the kitchen with the kids when James comes downstairs and gives them a speech about how he's going to win the case and prove the other woman a liar. Sophie notices even more how James is so compulsive, willing to do anything to win. James and Kate head to court, where James meets with Angela before the trial. Angela briefs him on how to answer questions in front of the judge, advising him to present himself as a feminist who supports women and cares about women's consent. In the restroom, Angela speaks with Kate about the girl who accused James of assault in the 90s. According to her mother, the girl now lives in Australia. Kate feels uneasy hearing this. During the trial, James takes the witness stand. His task is to prove that his relationship with Olivia was mutual and consensual, highlighting how they enjoyed their time together, bought gifts for each other, and even spent her birthday together while Sophie and the kids were traveling. Sophie recalls that day vividly. James had even called her, asking for a video of the family as if he didn't want them to be away while he spent time with his mistress. Despite the pain, Sophie listens to all of this and tries to keep her composure for her husband's sake. On the witness stand, James claims that in the elevator, Olivia initiated all the affection and that the aggressive nature of their interactions was something she enjoyed throughout their relationship. He paints their intimate moments as consensual and playful. When it's Kate's turn to question him, she methodically breaks down the rough nature of their interactions, proving that they were too aggressive to be considered consensual. Kate also brings up James's infamous phrase, "Don't be such a prick" tease, which Olivia had mentioned. James denies ever saying something like that, remaining adamant that he would never use such words. Kate proceeds to ask James if he truly believes Olivia is lying, and what her motive would be if that were the case. James replies that Olivia wants to ruin his career and his life. Kate counters, saying that if Olivia's goal was to destroy him, She could have simply told Sophie about their affair. Kate then directly accuses James of raping Olivia, pointing out that he knew exactly what he was doing when he called her a prick tease. Losing his composure, James screams in front of the court, vehemently denying that he raped Olivia or was a rapist at all. In that heated moment, Kate senses that James recognizes her as Holly. At the same time, Sophie, observing the scene, also realizes that Kate is her old schoolmate. After the trial, James and Sophie leave the courthouse. In the car on their way home, James admits to Sophie that he fabricated the statement about being in love with Olivia. He explains that it was necessary to emphasize their relationship as mutual and to make himself appear like the good guy in court. Sophie is left speechless by this revelation. When they arrive home, their children and Christina greet them with a celebratory cake, marking both the end of the trial and James and Sophie's anniversary. While James enjoys the celebration, Sophie can't bear it any longer. She excuses herself and leaves the house. In her distress, she goes to see none other than Kate, or more precisely, Holly. Sophie immediately tells Kate that she looks familiar, aside from the fact that Kate has been prosecuting her husband, and asks if she knows Holly. Kate denies everything, but Sophie has already noticed that Kate uses highlight strips to mark her notes, just like Holly used to. This confirms Sophie's suspicions that Kate is, in fact, Holly. Shocked by this revelation, Sophie runs out of Kate's office in disbelief. Back at home, James is haunted by memories of the two women he crossed paths with. His thoughts are interrupted when the children come to him, complaining that they can't sleep. Meanwhile, Kate rushes to Ali's house, confessing that Sophie has realized her true identity as Holly. Kate is worried about what Sophie will do with this information. Sophie returns home but doesn't mention anything to James about her discovery. However, James has something to confess. He admits to meeting Holly in the corridor at university, where they had a quickie. He insists it was consensual but admits that afterward, Holly seemed shaken. It dawned on him that Holly was a virgin at the time. Sophie lets out a bitter laugh, grasping just how vile her husband truly is, despite James' attempts to justify his actions. He then goes on to reveal the incident with Tom and Alec, and Sophie realizes how James manipulated her into being his alibi that night. The next day is the final day of the trial. Both Kate and Angela give their closing statements. After 4 hours, the jury delivers the verdict. The jury finds James not guilty. Sophie doesn't know whether to be happy or sad about the news. Chris comes over and sarcastically says, "Our boy dodged another bullet." Kate leaves the courtroom, and James glares at her. She sees Sophie at the door, and they exchange a look but say nothing to each other. Outside the courthouse, James gives a speech to the press about how his name has been cleared and thanks everyone who supported him, including his beloved wife. James is now back in his position as a member of parliament. Meanwhile, Kate is furious and smashes her TV at home. Ali arrives to comfort her in her loss and frustration. That night, the news reports on a new scandal involving another politician, officially closing the chapter on James' controversy. Sophie asks James if he really said to Olivia, "Don't be such a prick tease." This time, he admits that he did but adds that it was part of their playful moments, claiming Olivia liked risky situations. Sophie is stunned by how twisted and awful her husband is, realizing how easily he manipulates everything to always come out on top. She then goes to Ali's house and asks where Holly is. Ali avoids answering directly, saying she's no longer in touch with Holly. However, Sophie picks up on a small detail when Ali reveals that after leaving Oxford, Holly went to university in Liverpool, the same school Kate claimed to have attended. Before Sophie leaves, Ali finally hints that Kate is actually Holly. Afterward, Ali calls Kate. Kate panics, but Ali calms her down, reassuring her that Sophie knows her husband is a terrible person and might even be on their side. That night, Kate meets Richard and confesses her past to him. She ends their relationship, realizing that her affair with him was a result of the trauma James inflicted on her, leaving her emotionally unavailable and leading her to become entangled with a married man. The next day, Sophie packs her things and informs James that she's leaving him after finally understanding who he truly is. James drops to his knees, begging her to stay, but Sophie is determined to go. She doesn't want their children to grow up to be liars like their father, and she plans to tell them the truth. Later, Sophie meets with Kate. After hearing Kate's side of the story, Sophie apologizes to her and reveals the truth about Alec's death and James and Tom's involvement. She tells Kate that she has already contacted a journalist in hopes this will finally bring James the karma he deserves. Soon, Tom and James are arrested at their offices, and once again, Holly is the one prosecuting them. Meanwhile, Sophie retreats to the countryside with her children, spending time away from the chaos.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe and like for more videos like this.